Well, it's always a pleasure to be here in Madison County and also with a lot of you folks from neighboring counties. This is a nice little place to have meetings. It's a beautiful little place and a lot of nostalgia here as well. I want to kind of go over a few subjects with you, but the most important thing for us to do tonight is to get your questions answered. So at any time as we go through this, please feel free to stop me and to ask me some questions. If you were down at the Cattlemen's Convention last, 3 weeks ago now, 2-3 weeks ago now, we covered some of this material there, and I've added some things, taken some things out, but I want to hit some highlights on some issues that are kind of really front and center for us right now. Things that we've been working with. And a lot of times I'm finding that it's important that we get back to basics, and particularly when it comes to soil fertility and looking at soil management aspects. Sometimes it's important that we not forget about that characteristic. And I'm a big believer in this statement. Take care of the soil and it'll take care of you and your operation. This starts with this, with the soil sample, and I tell folks all the time that in the fine print of my diploma is written the statement that thou shalt recommend taking soil samples. But it is important, and I'm going to go through some examples tonight to kind of highlight how important it really is and how we can use that information to our benefit. As a general rule, we like to sample our hayfields every year and a third of our pastures each year, so that within the last 3 years you've got information on each of your pastures so that you can make some decisions on that. Why do we emphasize soil testing so much? Well, beyond the fact that it's important in terms of how much performance you get out of your grass, it's also important when it comes time to establish grass, because one of the things that we run into most of the time, whether it's legumes or grasses, either one, is poor soil pH or poor fertility is often a major cause of poor establishment. It's also a major cause of poor drought tolerance. I'm going to give you some examples of why that's the case as we go through here. And it's also the most common cause of poor persistence. I want to visit with you a little bit about what's going on with some of our, especially in our hayfields, but even in our pastures, we're seeing a lot of problems with this. And in many cases, it's getting back to pH and fertility issues. Now, first off, let's talk a little bit about where we're spending our money these days when it comes to the hayfield. And it comes as no surprise to most of you that we're spending a great deal of money on the fertilizer aspect. Even if you're using poultry litter as your primary source of nutrients, it's still a major part of your expense in producing hay. In fact, we're looking at about 48% of the variable cost, or excuse me, of all costs, about 48% of them are now tied up in fertilizer. And then we've got this little sliver up here, this little sliver of $19 is lime. Now, as we go through this, I'm going to try to convince you that the money that you spent here has more to do with the effectiveness and how far this money goes than anything else that you do on your farm. If you're paying attention to that aspect of it, it's going to reap dividends in the long run. Now, if we look at this in terms of a total investment per acre, that's a number that scares a lot of folks. But if you really sit down and calculate all your costs that you've got in hay production, I would venture to guess that you're not going to be too far off from that if you really look at all the costs you've got involved in it. So this is what we've been producing, right? We've been producing a lot of money in this. One of the things we've got to not lose sight of is the fact that there are two real major items that determine how much our forage is actually costing us. On a dollar per pound or dollar per ton basis. And this is true whether we're grazing or whether we're producing hay. We've got our total cost per acre, but then we're dividing that by how much forage we're producing per acre. Okay? So we got to understand that those two are working hand in hand to figure out exactly what our total forage cost is here at the end of the day. Now, if we go back to what I showed you earlier with that pie graph, if we were to look at current prices being about $641 per acre, all right? And this is 100% of what we believe those costs to be. What if we decrease our cost by 10% and we get down to 90%? Okay, so now we're looking at $577. But we also need to add in this other element here, of course, which is the productivity of those pastures or those hayfields. So if we're producing an average here of 6 tons of forage per acre, then that puts us at about $107 per ton is what our cost is. All right, so your hay, if you're an average producer in terms of cost and a pretty good producer in terms of yield, your average expense is going to be about $107 per ton of dry matter. Now, if you're below average in terms of yield, then your costs, and you've got the same level of input, then your costs are going to be higher on a per ton basis. You may be looking at $128 a ton. And it makes that value that you see sometimes in the market bulletin for hay be a little bit ludicrous when you start thinking about all your costs that you've got in the system. Now, what happens if we do cut our costs by 10%? Well, as long as we maintain that same yield level, we're actually coming out ahead. But if we cut costs by 10%, where is that normally going to come from? Fertilizer. That's our single biggest expense. It's the one thing that we've got some measure of flexibility with. And if we cut fertilizer, what's the most likely thing that's going to happen if we do that? Lower our yields, right? So if we decrease our cost by 10%, but we do it at the expense of a ton of production per acre, now instead of $107 per ton, now we're looking at $1.15 a ton. So we've actually increased our forage cost. You know, sometimes a shortcut is not always the best advice. Now, one of the biggest areas that we do not need to shortcut on is on pH. And I want to emphasize this, even in areas where we have a lot of poultry litter, sometimes we run into some problems with pH, and I hope to elaborate on that point a little bit as we go through here. pH is important for several different reasons. In the soil, one of the key characteristics of soil pH is that it affects the nutrient availability. How much of the nutrients that are in the soil are actually available to the root system of that plant. I'll give you some examples of that as we go forward here. The next thing that is impacted by this is soil structure. Soil structure is also influenced by soil pH. And what do I mean by soil structure? Everyone knows in the soils that we deal with, we have a problem sometimes with compaction. And if we have problems with our soil pH, those are the soils that are most likely to be impacted first. They do not have good aeration, they do not have good structure, they don't allow water to infiltrate well, they don't hold water very well. And this is, that's a factor or affected by many things, but one of the major things that affects it is soil pH. And part of that is that its effect on soil biological activity. And I'm not talking about, the real extremist kind of point of view here. What I'm talking about is looking at all of the bacteria and even as far as like earthworm activity within the soil is influenced by soil pH. And then finally here, although the list could be much longer than this, I want to hit the highlights. And this is one where we really start getting problems when that soil pH drops too low, is we get what's called aluminum toxicity in the soil. And pH is below about 5.5, and even below about 5.8, we can begin to run into problems with aluminum becoming soluble in the soil. And it actually burns the root system. I'll show you some examples of that as we go forward. Now, I mentioned plant availability of nutrients. That's one of the key factors that affects, pH is one of the key factors that affects how much of this nitrogen, phosphorus, and potash is available to the plant. So if we look, for example, for nitrogen, at a soil pH of 6.5, the broader this black bar is, the more available it is. If we look at a pH of 6.5 compared to 5.5, we can see there's a lot narrower band here. It's much less available down at that lower pH. Same sort of thing can be said for phosphorus, and even to some degree with potash. Even some of these, like manganese, for example, can become toxic to the plant as we get down lower. I grew up in Kentucky, and we had tobacco, and tobacco was very prone to having manganese toxicity. And so that's a common thing when we get down on the lower end of the pH range. Now, let me give you a real world example. This is a producer that brought in a sample. He brought in that soil sample and it was a pH of 5.6. And the target in his particular case, he was working with some tall fescue. We wanted to get him up to about a 6.2. So what does that mean in terms of real world dollars and cents? What is that value of that lime? Well, let's take, for example, the nutrients, the primary nutrients, N, P, and K, and we're going to look at the amount that we used annually in terms of pounds per acre basis. We're going to give it a unit price on the pound, $1 per pound of nitrogen, V2O5 and K2O, and the decrease in efficiency from a pH of 6.2, which is right about there, down to a pH of 5.6, which is right about there. So for nitrogen alone, let's say we're using 200 pounds at 60 cents a pound, which right now is trading at about 72 cents a pound, somewhere in the neighborhood. The difference between 6.2 and 5.6 in terms of pH is a decrease of efficiency of 35%. In other words, for every 100 pounds that you're putting out there, you're losing 35 pounds of nitrogen. You won't get into the plant as a result of that. So the value of that decrease is about $42, just in nitrogen alone. Then we have the phosphorus. And this is a little bit of a low number, but just suffice it to say we're being conservative here. Still, another addition to that, and then we have potash in there too. When we total those up for 1 year, we lost about $60 worth of value out of the fertilizer. And it doesn't matter if that's coming from the bag or from the poultry house. Those values are going to decline as a result of that. Now, $60 per acre. What's the spread cost of lime in this area?
$60 per acre.
About $60 per acre. However, that's 1 year. Okay, that lime should have an effect in most of our fields for at least 3 to 4 years, depending on how much nitrogen we're putting on and that sort of thing. So, the bottom line is that the lime is going to pay for itself. You pay for it in the first year. You make it up on the subsequent years. So lime has never been more inexpensive than it is right now in the grand scheme of things.